All right. Thanks for joining us. Thanks everyone for tuning in for another episode of Let's Talk Markets Live. I'm Dave Lauer, and really excited to have with me Dr. Rob Shapiro. Rob, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, Dave.
I love all the dog pictures in the background. Makes me happy.
I am obviously a dog lover.
Me too. Mine is, I'm up in Ottawa and it is snowing quite a bit right now. And my wife has the dog, well, one of the dogs out with her. And the other one she's like a pit bull. And then we have this little white dog and he could just get lost in the snow and he hates the snow. So, forget about it. He won't go out there.
I have two labs right
Nice.
now, and all labs love the snow.
Yeah, for sure. They love everything. I love labs.
They
They're just
do
like
love
the happiest dogs you can get, right?
They are.
All right. Well, Rob, is an expert in market manipulation, abusive short selling. He's got a lot of insight to share with us. So I'm just going to quickly give a bit of background. You are the founder and director of economic research and analysis at Sonecon. Did I say that right? And all right. I was wondering how to pronounce it, but I think you do some interesting work, and we can get into that in a bit. But in terms of your background, there's a lot there. Dr. Shapiro was the principal economic advisor to Bill Clinton in his 1991-92 presidential campaign. He was the Undersecretary of Commerce for Economic Affairs during the second Clinton term, where he directed economic policy for the Commerce Department and oversaw the Bureau of Economic Analysis and Census Bureau as it planned and carried out the 2000 census. And before that, co-founded and served as vice president of the Progressive Policy Institute, legislative director and economic counsel for Senator Daniel Moynihan, associate editor of U.S. News and World Report, and an advisor to every subsequent Democratic presidential candidate since President Clinton. So quite the resume, Rob. Thank you again for joining us.
You know, that's what happens when you get old.
Gets longer and longer, right?
Longer and longer.
So before we get into all of this abusive short selling and such, I think there's some interesting things going on in the world today, and we are in the midst of a transition. Today we found out that Paul Atkins is going to be the new chair of the SEC. I know that you have a relationship and have known Gary Gensler for quite a while, and in fact worked together. And so, maybe just to take a look backwards for a second, what do you think of Gensler's tenure at the SEC? Where do you come down on it?
Well, look, I think that he took on what is probably the most important financial issue right now, and that is how to deal with digital currencies. Mm-hmm. And he started a debate. And the truth is, we're not sure. We're not sure because the cryptocurrencies have been, are really speculative assets today. They have not really become integrated with the economy. Mm-hmm. The issue, what I think is a more important issue, is how do you treat tokens? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's very complicated, and it will be even more complicated if the financial markets actually begin to move to a blockchain structure. Mm-hmm. How do you ensure the kind of scrutiny to avoid manipulation, for example, mm-hmm. If the transactions are not going through clearinghouses, they're not going through neutral parties, or they're not always neutral, third party. Right. And So I salute him for opening these issues. And I don't think anybody serious thinks they've been resolved.
No, certainly not.
And, you know, look, he's a Democrat and he is more inclined than Atkins will be towards regulation. He's also, you know, he was a banker at Goldman Sachs.
Right.
So he understands the financial markets and he understands the costs of regulation. And I believe, you know, look, people may not agree with particular decisions he made, although let's bear in mind, you know, they're not just his to make.
Right? For sure. Right. He is an instrument of an administration and, you know, a policy in the executive branch, right? It's not like he's making these unilaterally, these decisions unilaterally. Right?
He is both a part of a presidential administration, and so he is there to carry out the president's policies in a general sense. He's the chairman of a commission who has to deal with lots of other commissioners. And perhaps most important, he's the head of a huge bureaucracy.
Yeah. That
has its own views about how regulation should or should not proceed. You know, I've headed huge bureaucracies and or overseen them, and it's very hard to get done what you want to get done if they don't want you to get it done. That's just true. It's not a deep state. It's something that, you know, these are people who have been invested in the ways that regulation or other policies are, you know, operate in the economy. And you know, if you're really determined and you're kind of clever and you got a strong stomach, you can get accomplished what you need to. But they'll always modify it.
Well, I think that's a really interesting perspective. I mean, the crypto side of things, I think what he did, generally speaking, was, you know, I sympathize with the need to police fraud, flat out, and I think that we have done a very poor job of doing that in the crypto industry. I don't necessarily think every token is a security, and I think he often, or at least the SEC often, took on cases that maybe it didn't need to. At the same time, though, on the equity market side of things, what you're saying really resonates with me, because I think Gary came into the SEC really wanting to transform equity markets and really seeing many of the fundamental problems of a lack of competition, concentration of market makers, the explosion of off-exchange trading, and the manipulation that results from that explosion. And he ran into this brick wall of SEC staff.
That's right.
You know, and one of them who was, I don't think, part of that brick wall, but one of the SEC staff that I was friendly with, you know, he told me it was like SIFMA has a satellite office at the SEC, and that's how it's been. And for those of you who don't know, SIFMA is the Association of Broker Dealers, and very much in favor of our current equity market structure, because those broker dealers, especially folks like Citadel and Virtu and others, they make a lot of money from the current system, just as Bernie Madoff did. And they don't want to see anything change.
You know, the SEC's kind of underlying responsibility is to maintain stable markets. And they're maintaining stable markets for the major participants in those markets. And in particular, the broker dealers. and all the broker dealers. And when you have distortions in the system, like manipulation, the markets in effect have learned to live with it, and indeed often learn to profit from it.
That's for sure.
And that means that going after them can produce what they think of as destabilizing the market. I'll give you an example. I was advising the SEC when they were writing Reg SHO. And I was in a big meeting with them, and I said, your draft has enormous loopholes, and it's not going to work. And I gave them some suggestions, and they said, that'll destabilize the markets. And I said, how? And he said, because it'll cause short squeezes. And I said, that's what you want when you have manipulation through short sales. You want short squeezes. But that's not, that is not part of the DNA of almost any large regulatory agency. Who's, look, their first law is maintain themselves. That's true of every bureaucracy.
That's right. Yeah.
True of every corporation.
Right.
Their second law is when they say don't destabilize the markets, what they're saying is don't make trouble for the major players.
When we spoke with John Welborn a couple of times on here, and we talked a lot about the history of Reg SHO, and one thing that he pointed out was this almost worship of liquidity above all else. And I think it fits in sort of with what you're saying, which is, even in the face of what should be a short squeeze, when the market should correct for manipulative behavior, it cannot, because of the loopholes in Reg SHO that are there, because of this worship of liquidity.
Right. And it's not really, I don't think of it precisely as a worship of liquidity, because liquidity is almost never an issue for these markets. It's the worship of the concept of liquidity. They already have it.
Right.
They already have it. It is the flip side of our enormous trade deficits and the fact that we're the reserve currency. The flip side of that is everybody else has got trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of value in dollars, and there's only one place you can spend it.
That's right. So I've got an interesting excerpt of a comment letter that you wrote at the time of Reg SHO. And it says, the record shows that the SEC has not disciplined a single broker-dealer, a single investment firm, a single staff or official of the NSCC or DTCC in connection with the massive illegal activities which the Commission acknowledges have occurred. The rules governing short sales must be tightened, and just as important, the new rules must be strictly enforced. I do not believe, however, that the SEC's proposals in their current form will have an appreciable effect at deterring these abuses. Do you feel that those were prescient words, sitting here almost 20 years, over 20 years later?
Absolutely. And, look, I was approaching it as, an economic analyst of manipulation, and not in a more realistic way as someone who understands the way Washington works and the way New York works and London works and Paris works. But this was a particularly dramatic example of it because the evidence was so clear, and the range of desired responses was also very clear. These were not intellectually, difficult issues to understand. And the only thing that was difficult was getting the data to establish it. Right?
Isn't that like a baffling thing? And I've said this before too. As markets have gone electronic, we should have the best data, this unmitigated access to data, the best researchers studying every single thing about it. And yet we're still talking in 2024, we're still talking about how difficult it is to get the right data and how much regulators struggle with studying markets because of that.
I recently was looking into spoofing and the impact on spoofing as a form of manipulation, and not simply in order to make 1.5 cents on a big trade, but its impact on the ongoing value of stocks. And getting the data, first, you can get the data, but the data come in a form that requires enormous work to use it in any useful way, particularly since, all data need to be cleaned up. And so you're talking about millions and millions of lines. And yes, you can write a program to organize it, but not to clean it up.
Bad data is bad data. Garbage in, garbage out, right?
So it's still a problem.
Yeah.
And, the other, and this goes directly to abusive short sales, and that is, in the heyday of abusive short sales, which was really the 1990s. And then the 2000s. It was it was the Wild West because you could do anything and nobody would ever, and in fact the institutions would facilitate it. That's what the DTC did. They facilitated abusive short selling. And in the name of stable markets, we have to complete all these transactions.
Right.
But there's no stock. We still have to complete
that details, right? Details.
Right. And and they knew that there was no enforcement at all. There is still virtually no enforcement. You can't. There's actually been more enforcement on spoofing than on naked short sales. Although
that's true. Yeah.
But of course,
but of a very specific kind of spoofing, right? Like the kind where someone is sending an email saying, "Look how I'm manipulating this stuff."
Right. And they did impose a large fine on J.P. Morgan.
Yeah.
But that fine was covering millions of instances of spoofing over 8 years.
Right.
So it really wasn't much of
it was a cost of doing business, right? As so much of these fines are.
In patent infringement, there's a concept called efficient infringement. And that's when it's cheaper to infringe than to license something you're going to use.
Right.
Well, the same thing goes for equity manipulation.
Mm-hmm.
There is efficient. It is more efficient to do it.
Yeah.
Than to not do it, and particularly since, as I said in that comment letter, and it is still true, there has never been a criminal sentence handed down for this.
Mm-hmm.
Never.
Right.
And including, naked short selling in the last month before Lehman's collapse in 2008. The numbers of shorts against the major financial institutions went up by, 150%, 200%, something like that. The number of naked shorts against them went up by between 50 and 100%, 100 times. It was all naked short.
Jeez.
Because everybody was shorting. You couldn't get any shares.
Yeah.
And they said, doesn't matter.
Right.
So even in the midst of, this systemic fraud by the major institutions,
right,
around mortgage-backed securities and credit default swaps, they were still trying to profit off of the revelation that they had done this.
Right. And no one went to jail for that fraud. So who's going to go to jail for manipulation and naked shorting? Right.
The single biggest mistake that the Obama administration made.
Yes, 100%.
So
and really fail. That I thought that was sort of the failure of the promise of Obama, was the failure to take on these incumbents, the failure to actually, the failure to address the foreclosure crisis, the bailout of the banks instead of the bailout of the homeowners.
Right.
Which was shocking considering the rhetoric that he was always spewing.
Well, I will tell you, I had several meetings at the White House with Larry Summers and others, and I said, you will not, the only way to address financial crises, we know this, is to address all of the underlying factors driving it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If you do not address housing, you are going to get a long and slow recovery.
Yeah.
And you're going to keep housing values low for half the country.
Right.
Unfortunately, I admire Barack Obama in many ways, but he never had an interest in economics or economic policy. Mm-hmm. And he just wanted to get past it so he could get on to things he cared about. Mm-hmm. And so he did not recognize that the underlying conditions had changed from the time he decided to run for president and the time he became president.
And so this period of time, it's interesting because you had Reg SHO passed, you had some changes made to it. And what we always hear from the industry today is that, yes, naked short selling was a problem. That, yes, examples like Overstock and Dole Foods, those were serious problems, but it's all been fixed now. And that doesn't happen anymore.
It's really a remarkable position because, I don't know, a year ago, in the context of something else, I just decided to look at the threshold list over time.
Yeah.
And over the previous 6 months. And to see whether it was being enforced. Which is
you got a surprise off that one, didn't
problem, right? And by according to those rules that allegedly solved the problem, no stock should be on the threshold list for more than 18 days.
Yeah.
That's what the rules say. At that point, they're bought in, right?
Yeah.
And
yes, exactly. Mandatory buy-ins. That's the rule, right?
There were 33 stocks that had been on the threshold list for at least 4 consecutive weeks. There were large numbers of them that had been on for 5, 6, 7, 8 weeks.
Yep.
Which is to say, the rule was not being enforced.
Yep. Yeah, I think at one point, oh man, I wish I had these numbers handy. But we another thing that we'd had this exact conversation with John Welborn, and he had shown Overstock was on there for months at a time.
Oh yeah.
That ETF, they're ETFs in which they're just that's it. They're either like XRT, I think, is on there for years now,
right?
With no one doing anything or concerned about anything. And the XRT is an interesting one because that one really surprises me, because if I'm the issuer of an ETF, then that's actually impacting my ability to collect fees from the people holding the ETF. You would think that folks like ETF issuers would have a vested interest in this problem. But and yet it seems like everyone's like, we're not going to deal with that because we're all doing just fine. And there's no reason to upset the apple cart here.
Well, moreover, when you see that kind of phenomenon, it's usually a limited number of big players.
Mm-hmm.
Not always, but that's the norm anyway, who are carrying this out. And they want those big players to keep on playing.
That's right. So do you think, a lot of people, they get very focused on the FTD issue. And there's some pretty compelling, I think there's some pretty compelling evidence in markets that FTDs are still being abused, that they are being rolled perpetually, that they are being covered up through netting at the NSCC. These are all sort of fundamentally back to what you were talking about, the loopholes in Reg SHO.
Right. And the other thing to keep in mind is that you can't do this with you can't use these kinds of approaches to manipulate NVIDIA. Mm-hmm. Or IBM,
right.
Or General Electric.
Right.
You can only do this to manipulate young, fairly small companies. They are usually technology companies, and usually companies whose founders are technologists, not financial people.
Yeah,
and they don't know what to do.
Right.
And so they try to live with it. And until some of them are brought down by it. Because certainly the ultimate goal of a large-scale manipulator is to manipulate the company out of business.
Right.
Because then they never have to cover.
Right. So let's go back. Let's keep going actually forward now. So we talked about Reg SHO, and if folks who are listening have questions, feel free to post them. We're seeing some interesting comments roll in, and we'll happy to take any more questions. But 2021 comes along, and it was a pretty crazy time in the world, but it was a pretty crazy time in markets, right? When GameStop happened, and it looked and felt at the time that there was something really nefarious, really manipulative taking place in that stock, that there were really massive short positions out there. And of course, then you did have a short squeeze, which, was pretty short-lived, right, at the time. But it got a lot of people caught up in this and learning about these problems in markets for the first time. How much have you looked into that situation, and sort of what are your thoughts on it, and on a lot of the theories of the short positions, the FTDs, and all of that led to that squeeze?
I think, look, any stock can be the subject of a speculative run-up. And because particularly, a stock like GameStop, which is, again, not a stock with a billion shares, right?
Right.
And and in this case, it was triggered by a real piece of news that speculators thought both some investors and some speculators thought would actually produce better results for GameStop. But pretty quickly, the run-up was so large, and it was, it just spiked, that it attracted the hedge funds.
Yeah.
And the hedge funds ended up, there was this kind of, David Goliath story.
For sure.
It was all these guys on Reddit. That wasn't what was happening there, because you knew that wasn't what was happening, because the price was way too high. How many shares can most Reddit investors buy when the stock is $300? Right.
That's when the institutions can make moves, right?
And you had institutions trying to profit on both sides. It was a war between hedge funds. That the hedge funds that said we can drive it up and then get out, and the hedge funds say we're going to drive it down because we're shorting it. And it's look, it is a good case study of the ways in which I see someone up H.
Right, I had to pop that up. Right.
The ways in which the small investors really can only ride a wave that is being created by institutions. They are such enormous buyers and sellers, and it's I have to say, I'm being anti-speculation has cost me a lot of money.
You didn't buy Bitcoin really early, Rob?
The truth is, I was doing serious thinking and analysis and research about blockchain a long time ago. 2012. And I saw and still believe in the enormous economic implications of blockchain. its efficiencies are too great to not integrate into the system. They're technological barriers right now.
Yeah, right.
Not, nothing in the kind of the nature of blockchain, the way that blockchain handles transactions. But you would think that someone who was so, involved in it so early would say, yeah, why don't I take $1,000 and put it in Bitcoin?
Listen, I know your pain, and I can say maybe what I did while I made money off of it was even worse. So I found out about Bitcoin in 2010, and I was in high frequency trading at the time, and there were a bunch of people on the desk that were like, hey, check this out. We looked at it, and I'm like, I'm just gonna throw $200 in just so I can pay attention to it, and I bought 100 Bitcoin.
Oh my God.
And if I had held on to those, let me tell you, I'd be in the Caribbean right now.
You'd be in the Caribbean. Yeah.
I did not, because then it went up like crazy, and I was like, this is nuts. And I mean, I was a trader, and I sold, and I made plenty of money. It was great, but boy, nothing compared to what it could have been.
Right.
But I'm with you. I mean, I personally, I think crypto is sort of the evolution of money. I think this is the next generation of money. I'm a big fan of a particular technology called Avalanche, and have been an investor of that for several years now, especially because of how it can integrate with the regulated system, which I find particularly compelling. But so I know a lot of people that I've heard from, when I posted that we were going to talk to you, they wanted to talk about tZero. They wanted to talk about blockchain-based settlement and clearing. And they come certainly from the perspective of the current system for settlement and clearing has fundamental problems. They see a lot of corruption in it. They see problems like you're identifying, where there is no enforcement on any issues. So you either believe the DTCC and NSCC are pristine, and there's no one who's ever done a bad thing there, or something else is going on.
Right. Well, I'm happy to talk about tZero. Acknowledging that I have a personal interest, in the sense that I'm on the board of Beyond, which took over Overstock, what Overstock became, rather.
Right.
And and they're the biggest single investor in tZero. The model is right. Why they have not been more successful. Part of this is that whole market is still constrained by technology, by its technology. It cannot scale yet.
Yeah, that's right.
And to me, that's a technological problem, and that consequently will be solved.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But it hasn't been solved yet.
And there have been efforts to, Australia, for example, tried to switch over to blockchain-based settlement and clearing. That fell flat on its face, right?
Right. And, look, it took a long time for people for a mass market for the internet. It had to scale up.
Yeah.
And in particular, scale up so it could produce content that people wanted.
Right. That's right. Yeah.
Right? And it's a pretty simple economic proposition. And I think the same thing is true of blockchain settlement right now. That doesn't mean that companies in this space couldn't do a better job of identifying assets that people are interested in to tokenize.
Mm-hmm.
And create a market in those assets. Why? Why not? I don't know, because maybe all the kind of entrepreneurial and technological people in that space are, chasing AI.
Yeah.
But
do you think what's happening with tZero, for example, right now, is something where there's now sort of this hook into the regulated space? And I think Patrick Byrne has talked about this idea that companies can start to issue securities directly on tZero and start to migrate their shareholder bases over. But again, as you're saying, like, we haven't actually seen at least anyone really successfully do that.
Right. And, who knows? Maybe part of it is technology, part of it is personnel. Would there be Tesla without Musk? I don't think so. Another company would have been founded and, set the terms for the EV market, but later.
Right.
And so maybe that, the EV market made economic sense.
Right.
And so does blockchain settlement.
Mm-hmm. And so what do you see? Like, tell us a bit more about Beyond then. What role do you see it playing in maybe a future financial ecosystem like this?
What role do I see?
Beyond.
Oh, Beyond.
Yeah.
Look, the holdings of Beyond in blockchain, and there are some very sound holdings. A company called GrainChain, which is very successful, and it manages supply chains in agriculture. And it's got good leadership, good technology, and a good customer base. They could become a very large company, I think, in time. Just like every other new technology, there's resistance from those invested in whatever was the previous system. And I think that's a major factor in why blockchain settlement has evolved more slowly than I thought, and certainly much more slowly than Patrick Byrne thought.
Yeah.
The truth is, Beyond is a public company that needs to show positive revenues for its shareholders.
Right.
And so its ability to be a real player in that, I think, is limited. It went under as Overstock because the founder of Overstock was committed to it.
Right.
Indeed, if he had had his way, he would have sold the retail company and put it all in blockchain.
Yeah.
He has been a constant investor in crypto, so he's doing fine.
Doing just fine, I'm sure. Yeah. So I wonder, we're sort of confronted with this really interesting time that we're about to enter into.
Say one other thing about
sure.
Beyond, and that is, at the same time, Beyond is a major investor in a suite of blockchain companies that at least are still in business after a decade.
That's something impressive in this industry.
Which is impressive, and two which the market pays attention to. And so, I have every reason to believe that its commitment is an appreciating asset for Beyond.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to make that clear.
Yeah. Understood. And sort of like just thinking along the lines of, almost maybe tangential to that, but we are entering this time with an SEC that's going to be very pro-crypto. That is sort of, one of the guiding principles, it seems, for Trump in his selection. It was the only thing he talked about in the announcement of Paul Atkins. Really, the only policy thing was what is his crypto bona fides and how strongly he was going to be pro-crypto. And so it seems like there is a unique opportunity now to get that technology into the heart of financial markets. However, at the same time, you're likely dealing with a deregulatory SEC and one who likely does not see the same kind of issues around shorting and manipulation and settlement that we're talking about.
Right.
Do you agree with that? And is it contradictory? Is this sort of like just superficial support of crypto, or do you actually think that this is step one into bringing crypto more into the fold of the traditional financial system?
Well, honestly, we'll have to see. And, we really don't know how to integrate crypto into the financial system. And, I think that I've never spoken to Gensler about this, but I am sure that that should have been at least a significant issue for why he's been cautious. I will tell you, if there is a kind of push to push it into the system without having thought it through, it will be very damaging to crypto. Because you just need a financial crisis that is blamed on that, and everybody will stay away from it for another decade. Particularly because if you have that, there will be a big clampdown on regulation.
Yeah.
So the advocates, be careful what you wish for.
For sure.
These economic systems are so much bigger than any piece of them.
Yeah.
Including crypto, including the dollar, for that matter.
Right.
It's like they say about natural disasters, don't mess with Mother Nature. Well, don't mess with global markets.
Don't mess with them, right? Yeah.
Unless you're prepared to weather a big storm.
Yeah. I think this is an interesting specific question we got from YouTube. Do you think, you being sort of tapped into Overstock and what they have done in the past and what has happened, that was one of the main things that that they did was this crypto dividend to try and root out the naked short in the stock. You know, so what did you think of that? And do you think that's something that we'll start to see more of if you have the SEC with a pro crypto stance?
Well, let me say that creating that dividend, the regulatory, hoops that had to be jumped through,
right,
both before and after,
mm-hmm.
were enormous.
Right.
And it took someone with the commitment Patrick Byrne to bear that. Most companies wouldn't. Now, there are crypto-based companies that could see it. Look, I think it's a service that they could provide. And they just need to figure out how to do that efficiently. So, look, I like the idea of a digital dividend because it's a way, particularly by non-crypto companies, because it's a way of introducing it to millions of people.
Right.
And one of the things that we need before crypto and blockchain, but particularly crypto, can really become more significant to the system is a lot more financial literacy about it.
Mm-hmm.
It is now kind of dominated by speculators,
right,
and not investors. And they have the literacy, but the literacy isn't very relevant to the act of speculation anyway.
Right.
But if you wanted to go beyond that and integrate it into the system, people have to understand it enough to feel comfortable with it.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same paradigm whenever when Bill Clinton and then Barack Obama wanted to change the organization of healthcare.
Yeah.
People don't mess with my healthcare. It's too much risk. Health is so important that it's too risky. It's not like they liked the system that existed. They hated it.
It's amazingly bad. Just stunningly terrible, right?
Yeah, and was worse before, much worse. And, and well, people feel about their money a lot like they feel about their health.
Right.
So, you want it to go past speculation. Well, you got to figure out how to make people who are not, who don't come into it as enthusiasts, but just as people who invest, and spend money, come into it.
So let's take a step to the side now, and as we finish up, and I very much appreciate the time you spent with us. You talked about how you've been doing some work in manipulation and market manipulation. You've obviously spent a lot of time studying short selling and abusive short selling. How much of a problem do you think those two things are in markets today? And what do you think, if you were looking at the current, at the new SEC that's coming in, what do you think you could advocate for them to do to address these issues that they might actually be willing to do?
But I think that, market manipulation is systemic in this system. And that means that naked short selling, which at one time was one of the most prominent forms of manipulation, there are now lots and lots of others. It's true that there's no enforcement of Reg SHO. But it's also true that you got to deal with your compliance officers, and there are hurdles, more hurdles than there used to be. But there are lots of other ways to manipulate markets now. And the people who are coming up with these ways are people with enormous financial market expertise.
That's right.
And so you can create the equivalent of naked short selling in the options market, for example, where it's not picked up at all. And then there's spoofing, and then there of course have always been these forms of manipulation. But what the SEC needs to do is figure out how they can learn about these. They need financial literacy and manipulation because they're years and years behind. And
I once proposed, maybe you would really appreciate this. I once proposed this to the CFTC, but I also thought the SEC should do this, is that they should create a sandbox with all of this data and offer whistleblower type rewards for people who come in and identify forms of manipulation that are then subjects of enforcement actions.
Right.
But you would need access to like the cat data in order to do something like that.
Right. Look, they could make it a requirement that I'm not sure how to do this, but there could be a requirement that in effect would give broker dealers incentives to share general information about modes of manipulation. Now, they're not going to share their instances of manipulation.
Right.
But the truth is, there are some large institutions that whenever there's a spate of manipulation, they're always involved. And then there's some which are not. They do differ. They're not all doing manipulation. They're all doing some, I suppose. And after all, the markets run on inside information. It's they're competitors, there ought to be a way to induce those who are not to explain to the SEC how those who are doing it.
Yes, that's right. So I honestly, this has been great. Thanks for joining us. I can tell you we're almost at 4,000 viewers right now, which is one of our top streams ever. So
wow.
This is a topic that people are really interested in. And I feel like we could have done another one of these. So, we'd love to have you back on maybe in the new year to continue the conversation, maybe as we see what the SEC priorities end up being,
right,
and as we start to think about what we can do from an advocacy perspective to try and push for these changes.
We just mentioned, I've been doing a lot of work recently on patent infringement which is an indirect form of market manipulation as well. And the dynamic is very similar. You know, you have large companies just stealing the patents of small companies, knowing that it's efficient, and that they'll probably never get caught. And it's a look, in a age like ours, where almost all value rests in intangible assets, and the economy runs on successive waves of innovation. This, I think, has become a much more important issue than it formerly was. So maybe sometime in the future, I'll come on and we can talk about that.
I'd love to. That sounds fascinating. So again, Rob, thanks for joining us, for taking the time, a whole hour out of your day. We really appreciate it. Our audience
enjoyed it, and I hope the viewers enjoyed it and learned something from it.
Absolutely. So everyone, thanks for jumping on and listening to Let's Talk Markets Live. We'll be back next week. We'll be on a Monday at 3 o'clock next week with, I think, a very interesting guest who probably has the same opinion of FINRA as most of our viewers do. And we're going to talk a lot about self-regulation and the failures of the SRO model. So fascinating stuff, I know. But again, thanks, Rob. It is to us, right? And you know what? Enough people are out there that it's interesting too. Never would have thought a few years ago, but here we are. All right. Thanks again, and have a great week.
Anytime, Dave.
All right.